Hey, it's Michael, and I've got a question for you. Have you ever been called a name that you knew was absolutely not true? And as a bonus question, how did it make you feel? Welcome to the follow-up question. I'm your host, Michael Ashford. Come with me on a journey as I explore what it means to find common ground at a time when it feels increasingly harder to do so. To listen more than we speak so that we can understand that our differences don't have to divide us. My aim with this show is to bring you perspectives and ways of looking at issues or topics that perhaps you haven't considered before. To teach you how to ask more, better questions so that we might become more reachable as people. I'm a former journalist who believes everyone has a story to tell, and it's only when we ask questions and listen that we reveal what connects us as humans. Our dreams, our desires, our experiences, our ideas, and what we stand for rather than what we are against. Something that absolutely drives me crazy about modern society and culture is this tendency we have when we disagree with someone to call them names, to assign labels to them rather than engaging in the uncomfortable activity of conversing with them, of having a conversation with them, of engaging with them in conversation with them so that we might be able to explore not only our differences, but the areas where we might agree. So often we call each other names to make ourselves feel better, to prop up our side or our opinion or our viewpoint, and to make it almost impossible for someone to disagree with us. The harsh reality of this tactic, this communication tactic that we employ so often, is that we are often creating or pushing people into the things that we want to avoid the most. The very labels and the very names that we are assigning to people are often not true. Yet they have this effect to push those people into those viewpoints, into those perspectives, into those labels and names with disastrous results. I think back to episode 56 of this podcast with the late Jesse Morton, who, when presented with the binary "you're either with us or you're against us" threat after 9/11, Jesse chose extremism. He chose terrorism. That episode is absolutely worth a listen in preparation for this episode. My guest this week is Jack Buckby, and he, as well, understands that when you assign a label to someone that is untrue, he understands the dire consequences that can have. I hesitate to call Jack a former far-right extremist because of the connotation that brings with it, and because he no longer is that person. But as you'll hear in this conversation, it is incredibly difficult for Jack to leave those labels behind. Now, Jack is a conservative, and as you'll hear, he is deeply concerned about a lot of very important issues. He happens to look at it from a conservative mindset. And what has been frustrating for Jack is for so long to see the label of far right assigned to people who are actually not far right, plus the label of far right not being appropriately attributed to those who are. It's muddying the waters, it is causing confusion, and it is leading to lives destroyed and progress to be, if not stunted, completely stalled. I'm not saying we have to agree with everything that our opposition believes and thinks and feels, but I am saying that we need to get better at digging into the uncomfortable discussions where we don't agree and leave the name calling out of it. Leave the assignment of a label out of it because of the ramifications that it can have for someone's life. With a lot of the work that you do, it seems like if I may, can it be boiled down to we have a lack of a solid definition of what it actually means to be far right?
Yes, I would say that's absolutely true, and the people in the far right would also say it's true. It's something that we talked about for a long time. It's something I talked about when I was a teenager. A lot of people in the far right will, of course, deny that they are far right, but also a lot of people in the far right will say that they are far right. So there's a bit of a disconnect there, but it's absolutely true. And I think the reason why we have this problem is that it's politically convenient for a lot of people to label their opponents far right. Um, Maybe we can talk a little bit later about Kathy Hochul, the governor of New York, who's doing exactly that to Lee Zeldin, the Republican governor candidate right now. It's very easy to just label people something they're not, and then it muddies the waters and makes it very difficult to identify people who may actually be extremists or dangerous.
Now you have experience in this. You know, you've been there. For the listeners who aren't familiar with you, let's take a step back and talk about how you came to be associated with far right groups. You're now out of those groups, but how did you come to be associated with them? Because I think we can start to tie some things together with what you just said.
Right. So I was known in the British media as the boy wonder of the far right. Obviously, not so much a boy anymore, looking a bit haggard these days. But I was the boy wonder of the far right from age 15. Well, it was a little later they called me that in the media, but I became active in the British National Party, which was a white nationalist political party in the UK. When I was about 15, it was mostly just online stuff to start with before I actually started getting physically involved with the party. Um, but I come from a working class town in northern England near Liverpool. My family are Scousers from Liverpool. And I saw around 2008, the time of the economic crash, I saw what was happening to working class communities in the north with regards to mass immigration, with regards to the economy. And the main political parties didn't really want to talk about those issues because it was difficult. It's very easy to be accused of being racist if you talk about large scale immigration, and so the parties just didn't want to talk about it. And that kind of left working class communities in a bit of a rut because what I saw in my town was people coming from the European Union, white immigrants actually, from Poland and so on, and they would be working for less than minimum wage through some loopholes with regards to the European Union. I think because they were European Union workers, I think their minimum wage was what it would be in Poland rather than England. So, or maybe they were just breaking the law. But anyway, I saw what was happening. People were losing their jobs. And then when I went to neighboring towns and villages that were more diverse than where I was from, I saw entire neighborhoods being transformed. Suddenly, it didn't look like England anymore. And then when you hear on top of that about the Muslim grooming gangs, which is a problem we have in the UK. Maybe we can talk about it later if you've not heard about it, but it's majority Muslim grooming and rape gangs going on in white working class towns, young girls being groomed with drugs and alcohol and raped and their lives ruined. Some girls have gone missing and never been found. When you hear about all those things, and when you see that the major political parties are unwilling to talk about it because it's racist to do so, when, by the way, these issues affect people of all races, they should have been talking about it, you'll go to the only party that or political outlet that is talking about it, and that's exactly what I did. And so I ended up in a white nationalist political party called the British National Party, the BNP. So did about 1 million other working class people who voted for them in 2009, many of whom were not racist, but were desperate for someone to say something. And it went from there.
So, Jack, it seems like, to go back to what you first spoke about, this quick rush to label anything that you maybe disagree with, or maybe even perhaps I'll use the phrase don't understand, as far right, as extremist, as racist, as anti whatever. The danger of that, you posit in your book, Monster of Their Own Making, is that you're doing the very thing, you're setting people up for the very thing that you don't want to happen, which is, as you just alluded to, if you're going to call me far right, and the only people that are caring about about this issue that at its core is affecting me, I'm going to go to the people that say
Right.
this is an issue. why is that so? Why has that become so extreme that the position is, if you even care perhaps about these things, it's got to be labeled one thing or another? Why have we jumped there in your mind?
So I am a former far right activist, but I'm not left wing. A lot of people leave the far right and become left wing. There's a few reasons why, mostly because they want an easy life and they know that's the easiest way to do it. They know that the only way you're considered to be no longer extreme is if you become left wing, because being a conservative these days is to be extreme if you listen to the sort of establishment media. Um, the reason why we've got into this mess, I think, is because politics has shifted so far to the left that it's it's very easy for them to position anyone who's on the right as extreme because the center seems to move with it. And that's something I wrote about in the book too. It's become politically convenient to label your opponents far right because it's such a scary thing. Nobody wants to be called that. Obviously, people who were considered a normal conservative 20 years ago, or even just like a centrist 20 years ago, are now considered right wing or far right. And it's really disingenuous. You know, it harms discourse. It makes it harder to identify who is an actual extremist, who is somebody who wants to deport people based on race or hurt people based on race or commit anti-Semitic violent attacks and so on. It's when you're calling someone like, as I alluded to earlier, Lee Zeldin, the governor candidate for the Republicans in New York, if you're calling him a far-right extremist, which is what Governor Kathy Hochul did recently, you're going to make it very difficult for people to know what's true. And also, you're going to embolden some people who are extremists on your own side, too. As we saw, Lee Zeldin was attacked with a knife on stage last night. And, you know, when the far right makes accusations that are inaccurate, they put people in danger. When the far left does it, they also put people in danger, too. I think we need to be talking about this. But again, it's very difficult because that whole thing has been so skewed, and it's been so skewed because it's convenient. Just label your enemies this, that, or the other. They know that it's one of the most horrible things you can be called. You know that they're going to spend the rest of the campaign or the rest of their life defending themselves. I'm not far right. I'm not far right. Please, you know, I'm begging you, understand me. It's very easy to just put people in a hole that way. And I'm very much in that hole too. You know, I'm in a position where conservatives don't want to talk to me because they think, oh, well, he used to be in a white nationalist movement. Can't talk to him, otherwise I'll get labeled it too, terrified, rather than talking about the issue. And then the left won't talk to me because they say I'm, quote, still a Nazi because I didn't become a leftist, you know? And by the way, when I say I'm a conservative, mostly a conservative, I don't really know what I am. I'm somewhere in the middle, is what I would say.
You and I are very similar in that vein. I call myself an independent these days. Even that has a connotation to it. I grew
Right.
up in Kansas, in the middle of you know the red alley that runs up and down the middle of the United States. And I would say on a lot of things I do lean to the right slightly. But something that you wrote about, something that I've heard you say before, Jack, is that the horseshoe theory, that
Mm-hmm.
the far left and far right are actually far closer to each other than
Mm-hmm.
they appear to be, because I believe of tactics. Am I saying that correctly, or how they present themselves out there in the world?
Yeah, you know, you come full loop. Anti-Semitism, for instance, is one of those examples. You know, the far left in the United Kingdom, which briefly had a major hold over the Labour Party, which is basically our Democratic Party, I suppose, in the UK, was briefly run by Jeremy Corbyn, who is accused of being an anti-Semite. I would personally say I think that assessment is fairly accurate. He would disagree. We heard, you know, some arguments coming from the Labour Party in the UK that would have made Hitler blush. It's not good, and there's many different things. You know, if you want to look at the economic side of things, you know, the far right comes all the way round to the same view as the far left in terms of economics. And the reason I point that out is because there's a lot of nuance when you use right, left, and a lot of people will say those terms are kind of outdated. And it's not so much that they're outdated; it's just that they mean different things. When I say far right, if you want to be really, really strictly accurate about it, far right really would be an ultra libertarian who doesn't want government, total anarchist, blah 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 blah, and also has socially conservative views. That would be true far right. When I say far right, I'm using it in a way that I think most people would understand because of the way it's been used, and in the most accurate way within that sort of sphere of definition. So I would say it's somebody with more conservative values and taking those values to an extreme. So rather than being, strict on immigration, they want absolutely no immigration at all and deport everyone who's not white. That's the kind of logic that I'm doing when I talk about far right issues. And I always say, when a far right terrorist is, committing a violent terror attack, they're not doing it based on their economic views. They're not doing it based on the fact that they believe in socialized healthcare. They're doing it over social issues. So that's why I don't really consider the economic side of things when it comes to ideology. When I talk about far right, I'm talking strictly social issues.
We've heard a lot over the last probably, 5 years now. I'll put that box or that time frame on it. Anti-fascist, anti-racist, the self-labeling of what I think a lot of people would say are the far left extreme groups.
Mhm.
You make an interesting point in the book, and I'd love you to dive a little bit into this. When you assign yourself those labels, you then begin to what you call other people. What you call other people can delegitimize them in an instant if that is the label you assign yourself. Can you dive into it a little bit and explain that a little bit more, Jack?
You have to remind me what was that
I'll actually
point?
read. I'll actually read from
Yeah, go ahead.
the book. By labeling themselves anti-fascist and anti-racist, the most extreme left-wing activists have granted themselves the power to attribute terrible labels to anyone they don't like, legitimized and reinforced by the number of people they get to turn up to a demonstration. That's
Right. So
dangerous territory, is it not?
yeah, absolutely, because they've established themselves quite successfully as sort of the moral arbiters. That they are the people who they hold the one truth, that we are the good people, you are the bad. And it's just a language trick. And it's a language trick that worked. And I don't think conservatives are very good at this. Just calling themselves anti-fascist is hugely powerful because it's repeated by the media, it's repeated by the politicians, and it's repeated by the most active people in society who actually care about politics. Most people don't care. Most people have a passing knowledge of what's going on, care about it in the sense that they will turn out to vote because it affects their lives. But the people who are actually really, really interested in politics, the people who are out on the streets, will parrot this nonsense of we are the anti-fascists. Antifa just means anti-fascism. Winston Churchill was an Antifa. He was an anti-fascist. It's just language tricks. It means nothing, but it works. And that scares me quite a lot because I've not seen any effective pushback on this. And one of the things I say in the book with regards to this, the only way you can push back on this is to stop being so defensive. They already are in a position of control. They say, we are the anti-fascists. You, by default, are the fascists. And everyone who is in the line, the target, is constantly on the defensive. I'm not a fascist. Please believe me. I'm not a fascist. No, people need to go on the offensive and attribute accurate labels to these people, which is they are extremists. They're often terrorists. They're dangerous, violent people. I've seen this myself. I was exposed to Antifa for the first time maybe I wrote about this in the book. I think it was 2011, 2012. I saw a member of Antifa punch an old lady in the face in Liverpool. That was my first exposure to them. And these are the people who call themselves the good guys.
Jack, I'm curious how, from your perspective, then how that fuels the leaders of the far right and makes their job easier. How does that happen when that is what you're, to use this phrase, what you're fighting against? How does that
Well,
fuel the mission of the far right?
So when you see the Conservative Party in the UK, or the less so the Republican Party in the States these days, it's certainly more populist and a bit braver these days. It's a lot of other things too. But when you see these mainstream parties and conservatives capitulate in many ways to the radicalism of the far left, and I don't just mean the left, of course, I mean the far left. When you see them capitulate to a lot of it because they're terrified of being called fascists and racist themselves, the only people left standing up to it are the far right. And again, that's one of the things that I saw. Absolutely nobody in the conservative establishment in the UK, in conservative-leaning media in the UK, at least back then. The media landscape has changed in the UK within even just the last year. It's gotten much better. Back then, I saw nobody standing up to this stuff or even acknowledging what these anti-fascists will do, that what they'll do to make your life a misery. They hounded me in university. They've put fake tips to the FBI claiming I was a terrorist. They got me banned from America for 5 years. They've done truly wicked things to my wife and people that I love. They threatened to kill my dogs when I was in university. It was dreadful. When you see this as a young kid, because a lot of young white men who see this stuff then go online and they're exposed to it more and more and more, and they start seeing what's happening. If the only people that are really, really brave in standing up to them happen to be far right, happen to be white nationalists, you may join them with some naivety. And over time, you'll be more exposed to the conspiracy theories that they push. And so you may be more likely to start becoming agreeable to those ideas. And you can very easily find yourself in a political movement that you may never have done otherwise, just based on the fact that they are the only ones willing to stand up to them. I saw that myself. Young men that I knew who started off as just normal teenagers concerned about mass immigration, suddenly they're talking about Israel, suddenly they're talking about the plight of the Palestinians, suddenly they're talking about how the Jews need to die, and you go from there. I saw that with many young men. It's very easy to get swept up in, and it all starts with the fact that they are the only people willing to stand up to extremists on the left.
Jack, as somebody who has been in what you have deemed the far right movement and then gotten out, where does personal responsibility fall in all that? You talked about the naivete of a lot of that, approaching that, but where does personal responsibility to not succumb to that extremist? Where does that extremist dialogue? Where does that fall?
Yeah, good question. So I get asked this a lot. It's you're just making excuses for these people or something. Well, no. From my experience, I'm talking about young white boys, and this is maybe a controversial thing to say, but I'm willing to say it. It's not. I'm already cancelled. The victims of far right extremism are the young men who are drawn into it too. It's not just the people they target. We are losing the lives of young men to this radicalism too. Those kids have families, they have parents, they have people who love them, and they destroy their own lives too. Young men I knew killed themselves. Young men I knew are now in prison. I don't want to see that happen to anybody. There's absolutely personal responsibility. And I'm absolutely an example of how you can overcome those things. But there's so many moving factors in this. I think there's definitely more responsibility if you're older, if you have a bit more experience. But when you're a teenager, as I was 15, and the boys that I knew were around the same age, it's a bit harder because you don't really understand the world quite as well. You're certainly more naive. I don't know. It's a difficult question. But at the end of the day, personal responsibility. Say you get pulled into a far right movement and you're trying to leave. We can make it much easier for people to leave, to have that personal responsibility, to see what they're doing and leave. But we have to create an environment where they can leave. Because at present, if you leave but you don't want to become a radical leftist, you have no chance. Look at the limbo that I'm in now. I run my own business and so on, and I'm okay. But for a lot of people who can't do that, you can leave far right politics, but you're never going to have a normal life. You're always going to be smeared online. You're always going to be attacked by far left extremists. and smeared as still a Nazi unless you become, say, a Black Lives Matter activist or something. If it's impossible to leave, then that personal responsibility doesn't really matter because there's not much they can do. They kill themselves, maybe? Is that it? That's what they want them to do. Which is why you'll see there's a thing, CVE, a hashtag CVE, and it's a sort of movement in an academic sphere, countering violent extremism. What you'll see among these people is that they are former far-right activists, but they're now advocates for some of the most radically left-wing movements, including Black Lives Matter, which I consider an extremist, violent movement, Marxist too. You'll see that these people are all advocates for extreme left-wing politics, and they will actively attack anyone who leaves far-right politics but who doesn't subscribe to a left-wing worldview. People who left the far right will do it too. It's such a difficult position for people. Let me tell you, the best way to get people out of far-right extremism is to allow them to naturally move towards a more moderate conservative worldview, because that's probably where those people were meant to go in the first place before they were pulled into the far right for one of the many reasons I outline in the book. Like, personal responsibility is important, but we have to create an environment where those people can actually leave, you know?
And assign proper labels to things too, right? That a conservative, someone who leans right, just because you disagree with perhaps their way of looking at the world does not mean that they are evil, wrong, terrorists,
Right.
fascists, Nazis. Like,
Yeah.
just there's a responsibility, I guess, on both sides to appropriately assign. I'll say assign labels, but I don't want to go there. Let's look at it this way, Jack. How did you yourself get out? What brought about or precipitated you finally realizing, hey, this is not something I want to be associated with?
So it was a multitude of things, specifically the BNP. I was being I went to university in Liverpool. As I say, I grew up on just the outskirts of Liverpool and went to the city for university. And as I was there, of course, I was hounded by the far left and Antifa because I was the BNP guy, as I was in college before university. But not only was I being targeted by Antifa, I was being targeted by the far right too, which is incredible because I was one of the reformers in the BNP. I was one of the people I didn't support gay marriage, but I did support civil partnerships. And the BNP's position at the time was no civil partnerships, no gay marriage, nothing. And so I was one of these people who was trying to reform it. I was one of the people who was on the side of allowing non-white people to join the party. So this is it might seem a little confusing that I was a white nationalist, but also a sort of reformer. I was kind of like stuck in this in-between where I had these white nationalist leanings, but at the same time, the sort of the moderate conservative in me was coming out, and I was just this modernizing sort of young figure in the party, and I didn't quite know where I was. And because of that, the most hard right people in the party, and including people who were in another party called the National Front, which is an older party that became the BNP but still existed, those men were threatening to kill me, and because they said I was a Jewish Zionist government state agent. And I would be contacted by the police fairly frequently. They were telling me that there was, people threatening to hurt me, to kill me. I even met with the police at one point. The police even wanted me to go undercover at one point. I don't know if I've ever said that in an interview, but they wanted me to go undercover. I didn't. And so when I realized, holy crap, some of these guys really are insane. One of the people who was threatening to stab me had been in prison for stabbing people. So it was a legitimate, real threat. That was a real eye-opener for me. Like, maybe I was way too forgiving of this party, and I've been way too forgiving of some of these people within it. And then for years after I left the BNP, I remained active in counter-jihad politics. So instead of talking about the race issues and all that, my focus was on, okay, well, one of the issues that drove me into far-right extremism in the first place was the Muslim grooming gangs. Maybe the politics I should be involved in should be just focused solely on that. And so I moved from far-right politics into counter-jihad politics, but I still had that streak in me where I was just young and angry, and I was willing to say outrageous things and do outrageous things and just be a bit more upfront and unpleasant and rude. And it's, and because the way I saw it is, if I'm shocking, people will talk about the issue. And it worked for a while. I did some shocking things on live TV. I stood in an election for a constituency where the member of parliament had been killed by a far-right extremist. I stood to replace her in an election, which a lot of people condemned. It was a bit of a progression out of that. And then eventually I left counter-jihad politics too. I still have my concerns about political Islam, as a lot of centrist normal people do, a lot of left-wing people do too. But it was a gradual sort of progression out of it. It was seeing the shock of what the far right really is, the threat it was to me, and also seeing the young men that I knew, either kill themselves or become increasingly radicalized to the point where they were banging on about anti-Jewish conspiracy theories, which I never sided with. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah.
There's a lot to that, but my point really is that it was a progression. It's not just a quick, I was wrong about this and let me leave. It was like a 10-year progression to get where I am now. And now I would consider myself, as I said earlier, I'm mostly conservative, but I'm also pretty liberal in a lot of ways too.
The Muslim grooming gangs. Let's go there, because it is a big issue right now. I see it a lot in the news that I follow, and that's coming out of the UK.
Yeah.
How does that issue get taken from one of obvious people are hurting and suffering at the hands of these gangs to the bigger issue of, well, if you of immigration and counter the culture of in this instance the UK? How does that get taken and built up into something that I think you would agree is it's not?
So the grooming gang issue, and for those who don't know what it is, it's in working class towns, and it's gangs of mostly Muslim men. There's some white men usually involved here and there, but or non-Muslim men, I should say, but like white non-Muslim men are involved every now and again. It is for the most part mostly Muslim gangs. What they'll do is they'll own a local takeaway shop or something, and they'll give free food to these young teenage girls who maybe don't come from the best families, or they come from poor families, and they take the food and then they get the alcohol and then they feed them drugs, and they'll groom them, they'll rape them. And what we saw in Rotherham, there was an inquiry into this. An independent report found that 1,400 young girls over a period, I forget the period of time, was systematically abused, and that the police had physically tore up some of the reports about it. The local authorities didn't want to talk about it. And this is all in the independent J report that covered all this. This is no conspiracy. It's true. Turns out the local authorities were too scared of being called racist for talking about it, so they let it, just keep on going for years and just ignoring it, hoping it would go away. And we had a recent investigation in Telford in the UK, and it's found that the same thing's been going on in Telford as well. It's happening all over the United Kingdom, and it's working class communities know about it, but the authorities don't want to talk about it. When I stood for election in Batley, Yorkshire, in 2015 or 16, you have to knock on the doors of local people to get enough signatures to allow you to stand in an election. You need like 10 people to say, yes, I want you to stand. And so you have to knock on a lot of doors to get those signatures. And every door I knocked on and I spoke about this issue, I'd say about 80% of the people I spoke to were either directly impacted by the Muslim gangs or knew someone who was impacted by the Muslim grooming gangs. One of the girls who helped me campaign have been affected by it too. It's a huge issue. Now, it was jumped on by the far right because, it's great. They've been campaigning for years that non-white people are bad for Britain. And so here's an example of non-white Muslim people doing a terrible thing, and they jumped on that issue. Now, a lot of people within those parties who jumped on that issue were doing it with the right reason, for the right reasons. A lot of them weren't. A good example of this is the Charlene Downs case in Blackpool. I met the Downs family. The daughter, Charlene, had been a victim of Muslim grooming gangs, went missing, presumed dead. Her body's never been found. Now, the BNP jumped on that issue. There was a recording of two men who were accused of killing her. and the police had placed a bug inside of their house. The bug was right near a television, so the audio they got was really terrible, but they thought they could hear that they talked about grinding up her body and putting it into kebab meat that was sold in their kebab shop in Blackpool. And that's the story the media ran with. It's the story that the BNP ran with and the far right activists ran with. But if you listen to that audio, it's very clear that there's a television playing. You can't hear what they're saying. Nobody truly knows what happened to Charlene Downs. And if anything, the most recent investigations found that actually it may have even been a white man that killed her. We don't know. And so my point there is when you avoid these topics, it's very easy for bad actors to jump in, take control of the issue. For years, I just assumed that this story with Charlene Downs, with her body being ground up into kebab meat and sold in a kebab shop, I just assumed it was true. And I was out campaigning all the time when I was like 17 and campaigning online, going to events in Blackpool to campaign for the family and so on. It's really just the fact that it all boils down to, it's, as I say in the book, there's a three-pronged attack that creates these extremists. And the first prong is a negligent political class. It's a political class that doesn't want to talk about those issues that affect working class communities. When you leave control of those issues to like dangerous people, you're going to radicalize people. It's as simple as that.
It's very similar to here in the United States where, obviously immigration is on the minds of a lot of people. There's a lot of change happening. And to even talk about the issue, you open yourself up to scorn, to in some ways a lot of what we've been talking about, to name calling, to outlandish threats against you simply for having a concern about the issue. Not
Right.
going any further than that, but saying, can we do something about this, please?
Right. I was going to say, is there any way that you can address the immigration situation in the US in a way that is concerned about numbers or concerned about the safety of the people coming over? Can you say a single thing about the immigration crisis without being accused of being racist? Is there anything you can say? Is there any way that you can word it?
Seems very hard.
There isn't.
Seems very hard, Jack.
There isn't. And that's the danger is it's like what I was saying before with Kathy Hochul and Lee Zeldin. You're just accusing your opponents of being far right because it's politically convenient. That's so dangerous because, if the Republicans weren't quite so brave as they are these days with, Trump still their leader, basically, and Trump will talk about immigration, whatever faults he might have, he will talk about that. If it wasn't for the Republicans like standing up to that, the only people that will be talking about it are like genuine far-right groups that do exist in the United States. I saw it in 2016 when I was sort of like a foreign supporter of Trump and that whole sort of movement of populist conservatism. I saw a lot of people from the far right, the anti-Semitic, pro-violence, far-right extremists were jumping onto that campaign. They really wanted to talk about those issues, but the Republicans kind of robbed it away from them. If you can't talk about those issues, you're going to make it very easy for people to join actual radical groups. And so, for all the faults maybe of some of the Trump-style politics, Democrats should actually be glad that mainstream people are talking about this.
Let's talk about how you and I actually came to connect. It was right after the Buffalo, New York mass shooting, and the unwillingness, two things: the unwillingness of Republicans to call it what it was. This is a far right extremist. It is on the right, but then also the jump to try to say, look at how left this person, like this is clearly somebody from the left, not just a denial of who they were, but then a try to assign blame to the complete opposite side. Right. In that situation, I want to go there, Jack. The importance of folks on the right to call it what it is. How do we embolden more people to do that? Because it seems like there's a fear.
It's like the far left set a trap. They call everyone far right, so they put the right on the defense. And then when the right's on the defense and they see that something like this happens, they're so scared that they might be tarnished or smeared with that action of that person because they've already been accused of being far right, that they want to like dismiss that attack as not far right, which is a stupid. Stupid's maybe a bad way, not the appropriate word. It's not a good way of looking at it because it doesn't help anything. It's unhelpful.
Yeah.
It doesn't help the situation. A better way is to say, yeah, that's a far right attack. Doesn't reflect what we believe. We condemn this entirely. This isn't right. What I've seen so many times when there's been a far right attack that I will see some conservative pundits, and actually I think a lot of conservative pundits are bad faith actors. They are. I'll name one actually because I can't stand him. Benny Johnson is a good example of this. He will take anything and run with it. Whatever he can say to get clicks, he'll run with it. And those kind of people, when they see a far right attack, they will jump on. If this kid who committed an attack once said that they supported socialized healthcare, they will say, "See, he was a radical leftist." Well, no, because some of the most far-right people I've ever known in my life support socialized healthcare. It's a pretty normal position for people to have, and it doesn't stop them being far-right extremists. It certainly doesn't make them Bernie Sanders supporters. My God, So this idea that throwing, like saying, "No, this is one of your guys. No, this is one of your guys. No, this is one of your guys." Who does that help? Who does that help?
So let's go to the issue of the day then. Not that guns and mass shootings aren't. January 6th. How do you view that?
See, what those people did was just so moronic. I don't know what they were. If these people were trying to advance the Trump agenda or something, then it was the biggest own goal. Because I don't see it as a terror attack. I see it as stupid people doing a stupid thing, wandering through the Capitol building, taking photos, acting like morons. Terrorist attack, I'd say the Black Lives Matter riots of 2020 were far worse and not considered an insurrection. If there was a time to invoke the Insurrection Act, it would have been 2020. January 6th, I think it's being used. This whole... Look at the January 6th committee. I've said repeatedly that this is a committee that claims to be investigating what happened on January 6th, but it's based on a contested idea. It's based on the contested claim that Donald Trump purposely incited and instructed people to enter the Capitol building and to commit violence. And that idea is contested, but not just by the evidence of what Trump actually said, but it's contested by people within Congress. And if the Democrats really wanted to find out what happened and do something productive, they should have allowed some Republicans on that panel who disagreed with that contested notion. Then they could have really had it out. They could have really done some investigations. But instead, it's being used as a political tool. And I don't think using the Black Lives Matter riots as a political tool is a good idea. I don't think using January 6th as a political tool is a good idea. We've got to the point now where if one side does anything and the other side can find a way that it can be misrepresented or exaggerated or something for political gain, then they'll do it. That scares me greatly because it's like a race to the bottom at this point. It's a sign that nobody can even consider the thoughts, the ideas, the concerns of the opposite side. And it also reflects this thing that I wrote about this in the book too. There's a study called the perception gap. It's the inability of people to understand the views of the opposing side. January 6th was stupid. I don't know why people even thought that was a good idea, but they did. I think it would be better to address the concerns that people have, like the election integrity issues. Why not have an open conversation about that? It will stop people doing stupid things all over again if we just talk about it. It's much better to talk than to just allow people to get so angry that they lash out, do silly things, and then use those things to smear half of the public as racists or terrorists or insurrectionists,
I got to ask, the leader of the House Republicans, Kevin McCarthy, basically refused to let the Republicans who did disagree onto that committee. So you only have Adam Kinzinger and Liz Cheney as the Republican resident. What's that?
Pelosi blocked them. Pelosi didn't allow them on the panel.
And that was what I was going to ask if I had that wrong.
Yeah.
So
So
I
that's something
didn't
that
know
I
that
heard.
part.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so that's the latest thing from the Democrats is they say, well, you never allowed them on the panel. That's not true. They were withdrawn because Pelosi blocked them. Pelosi only allowed the two anti-Trump Republicans on the panel, which they might as well be Democrats because at this stage, Trump controls the Republican Party, and if you wanted to be balanced, you should have allowed one or two people on the panel who disagree with the. How can you have a panel that claims to be investigating the truth when everybody on that panel agrees with a contested notion? Like, I knew from the start what the results of this January 6th investigation was going to be. The results will be that Trump purposely instructed people to go into the Capitol building and commit violence, and that he should be prosecuted and stopped from running for president ever again. That was always going to be the end result because the only people on the panel all agree with that. That's why Pelosi didn't want anyone else on it, you know?
Jack, is it disingenuous though to say that Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger might as well be Democrats? Isn't that the thing that you are guarding
Oh
against?
no, I just mean with regards to this particular issue.
Okay.
You know, because the only reason Liz Cheney and the other fella, sorry, I forget his name, are on that panel is to allow Pelosi to say it's bipartisan. But really, it's technically bipartisan in the sense that you have two Republicans on the panel. But is it bipartisan in the sense that you have people on the panel who reflect the overwhelming views of the Republican Party, who
Understood.
disagree with this notion?
That makes sense. What about the notion that we've seen recently? How do you feel about that he maybe not instructed people but that he did nothing that day? And I'm talking about Trump.
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
Where do you fall on that?
I don't think it's true. You know, and let me tell you, I can't vote in the United
Right.
States. If I could, I would certainly consider voting for a Democrat who was good on the issues I care about. I probably would be a conservative Democrat, but at this stage, I'd probably be more likely to vote Republican, which means I would end up probably voting for Trump in a presidential election. It's not to say I agree with him on everything. It's not to say that I think that everything he does and says is right. However, what I would say is he did condemn the violence. He did. Maybe he could have said it sooner, but you know, if he said it sooner, they could still say he should have said it sooner. You know, it's I feel like they've pushed him into this trap. You know, he did condemn the violence. He told people to go home, and he was dancing around. You know, he didn't want to anger his base because at the same time he wanted to make sure that people protested peacefully. And in fact, one of the first things he said during that speech was, you know, make yourselves known peacefully and patriotically. I mean, no matter what he said, I do feel as though the other side would do. They'll always say, well, why didn't he say this 5 minutes sooner? Why didn't he say it 10 minutes sooner? Why didn't he say it an hour before? It's like, at what point can he win?
My biggest fear coming out of the election that eventually then led up to January 6th was something that you actually wrote about in the book, which is, and I'll quote your writing in the book: smear and abuse good people at your own peril. It quickly creates monsters.
Mm-hmm.
And you and I had a conversation about 2 weeks ago before jumping on here that was one of my biggest fears coming out of the election of now 2020, which was when Joe Biden was elected the president of the United States. A lot of the message that you heard from the left was, thank God, now we can just get rid of these people. These people
Right.
being people on the right, that their way of governing their view of the world, we're moving on without you. So either join us or the country's moving on without you.
And they welcomed them with open arms.
I'll be very candid in saying that was the message that I observed from a lot of people. And when you do that, Jack, when you do that, you do exactly what I just quoted you saying. It quickly creates monsters when you make other people invisible. Would you agree?
Absolutely, it's what happened to me. It's what working class communities were completely dismissed as swivel-eyed loons. You know, so voters for a party called UKIP were called swivel-eyed loons in the national papers about 10 years ago. I remember that. When you demean people like that, yes, you're going to make monsters out of them because they're going to get extremely angry. It's not like you're just dismissing a silly concern. When you dismiss real concerns that affect people every day, I mean, that's a very easy way to make a monster, to make people so angry that they want to hit out violently, or suddenly, a whole group of people is responsible for that grievance being ignored rather than just the politicians that ignore it, and so on. Eventually you're going to find an outlet for that anger. And most people just shut up. Most people put their head down and just get on with their life and just say, well, this is the hand we've been dealt. Well, I'm going to be ignored for the rest of my life, and these are the issues we're going to have to continue living with. But other people, mostly men, pumped, with testosterone and anger, are going to start hitting out. That's what happens. And why is dismissing the concerns of such a large number of people a good idea? Listen, a huge amount of people in this country, whether it's true or not that there were election irregularities or wrongdoing or something in the 2020 election, I think there's evidence to say that most of the claims pushed by people like Mike Lindell are completely wrong. It's absolute nonsense what Mike Lindell is saying. But at the same time, there are other people who have identified real problems in terms of voter rolls being out of date, mass mail-in voting, creating chain of custody problems. Those things are true. So why can't we have that conversation and talk about these issues rather than just dismissing everything as false? There's some fault on the side of the right here, by the way, because the people who promote the Mike Lindell stuff are muddying the waters too, because then suddenly you can't talk about chain of custody issues, because it's like you're talking about this nonsense about China and code
From a guy
and
who
all
sells
this.
pillows.
Right. So there's some fault absolutely on the right here too, and I call this hyper-partisan sort of extremism. And it's happening on both sides. I feel like we've gotten ourselves in a mess. And when you dismiss those issues, you don't just create monsters, but you create people who recognize the other side as completely unwilling to talk to. They know that they're never going to listen, and so you end up with two sides just constantly doing this, knocking at each other, attacking one another. There's never any discussion. There's never any middle ground. I don't know how we get to the point where that middle ground, and this is something you talk about, where we can actually have those discussions. And again, I always like to bring up the perception gap study, which found that most people cannot accurately describe the views of their political opponents, and that with every degree a person earns from university, that gets worse. And just think about the kind of people who run this country.
So let's go there as we wrap it up here and begin to bring it home. Jack, you advocate for several things and how to fix this, but the two that were most, I guess, poignant or most relevant to me in the work that I do is we've got to start talking again, and we need the moderate, the majority of people in the middle who may identify as left or right to stand up and actually take back the conversation. How do we do that?
Well, I think it starts with conservatives being more honest. So conservatives have a role to play here. Conservatives need to admit that far-right extremism does exist and stop denying that it exists in the first place. But I think liberals need to be much braver because liberals have a lot of power to stop this cycle of radicalism. One of the prongs of the three-pronged attack I talk about in the book is left-wing extremists pushing people to the right, targeting people. Is one of the things that really cemented my position in the far right. Once I was in the far right, I didn't want to leave because, constantly being pummeled and pummeled and pummeled by left-wing extremists was like, well, screw you, you're my enemy now, and I'm just going to keep fighting back at you. If liberals were braver and they said, listen, we have this problem on our side, a lot of our people are not being honest. They're misrepresenting people as far-right extremists. They're bullying people who they wrongly claim are far-right extremists. And if we can control this and stop this, then perhaps we'll stop pushing people further into extremism. All it takes is some moderate liberals to stand up and say, woke extremists don't represent us. And if they do that more, then we can sort of move the center ground a little more back to the center. and maybe we can start having a discussion again. But as I say, it's on conservatives to be honest that the problem exists, and I think it's on the liberals to be a bit braver and stand up to the people on their own side. It's like if you've got an unruly dog, who's in a better position to control that unruly dog? And the unruly dog being the woke extremists. Is it the owner of the dog or the neighbor that it keeps terrorizing? It's the owners. Liberals have so much more power than they think.
Jack, what's a question that you wish you were asked more?
Great question. I don't know. A question that I've been put on the spot like this. I'm terrible. I wish people would ask me more why. Okay, not so much a question, but I wish that people would consider more what it's like to be young, far right, in the media, and a target of the press. I wish that people would want to talk to me a little bit more about that, because I was exposed to politics very young. I was in the newspapers very young. And from the outside, I was the demon to a lot of people. Actually, a hero to some people, but to a lot of people, evil. And the impact that had on me, at the end of the day, I was a kid too. It's like I was saying before, the victims of this stuff are the people who are pulled into it too. And I was very much a victim of it. It changed my life. I had a mental breakdown. It was very tough for me. It's been very tough for me to move on. I still really very much can't move on. It's 10 years later and I'm still talking about it, and I'm going to be talking about it for the rest of my life. I wish people would consider more the impact that radicalism has on the lives of the people that get swept up in it. And I think that human sort of concern and understanding, if you talk to people who get pulled into it and hear their stories about why they got involved in the first place, I think it can be really powerful. And maybe that's something that we need to sort of start having a conversation about this. You can't just look at these young kids as dangerous extremists who can't be saved. Like, look at them as kids. Look at them as human beings. And think about why they got involved in the first place and maybe how they could get out. I'm really passionate about helping young men avoid this. As one of my big concerns is I don't want young men wasting their lives and hurting themselves like I did, and potentially ending up in prison like some of my friends did, or killing themselves like other people I knew did. I just wish we talked more about the human impact of radicalism.
Hopefully this is a good starting point for a lot of people. So, Jack, thank you so much. I enjoyed reading the book. I know it's a couple years old, but even still relevant, still needed to hear your perspective. Thank you so much. I know this is never easy, so I appreciate your time, sir.
Thank you so much for having me on. I appreciate it greatly.
So many thanks to Jack Buckby for sharing his story on the show this episode. Please do me and Jack a huge favor. Share this episode with someone you know who might find some value in listening to our conversation. Share it with your network. Help spread the good word about the importance of asking more questions. And if you like the conversations with the amazing guests like Jack that I have on each and every episode, please subscribe so that you never miss when a new episode drops. If you ever want to get in touch with me, you can always email me. It's michael@thefollowupquestion.com, or you can go to my website, michaelashford.com, and reach out there. I'll catch you on the next episode of The Follow-Up Question. And until then, keep asking questions.